The best time to build an antenna out of junk you've got laying around in your garage is during a thunderstorm. Hi, I'm Rob, N1NUG. In today's video, I'm going to be building a cheap and cheerful portable 40-meter doublet using ladder line. Now, I already know this is not going to be the most convenient portable antenna. And whether or not it performs better than other options, that's kind of up in the air too. I'm guessing that it'll be on par with an end-fed half-wave. However, the reason I want to build this antenna today is because I've had this hunk of ladder line laying around for about a year now, and I haven't done anything with it. And I want to experiment and see how it works in sort of a temporary antenna before I commit to using this on my home station antenna, which I'm thinking of replacing. Before we get too far along in the video, I'm going to give you a little bit of a trigger warning here. This is going to be a bit of a hack job. I'm not going to really measure anything out too much. Everything's going to be eyeballed and hand cut and hand drilled and just kind of done in a bit of a crude manner. So if that's not your cup of tea, then you may want to skip this video. But if you don't mind that sort of thing, then let's build this antenna together. What I want to use to support the antenna is my telescoping 31-foot fiberglass jacklight pole. Now we're going to need something to attach to the mast that's going to hold not only the ladder line going up to feed the antenna wires, but also the antenna wires themselves going out. Now for that purpose, I found some plastic cutting boards at Walmart. I think I got a 3-pack of these, 3 different sizes, for somewhere around $3 or $4, something like that. And as you can see here, I've already started working on that part. And what I did is I took the smallest of the cutting boards in the kit and I eyeball cut it into this rough T shape. This is actually the corner of the cutting board. And of course that was sort of inside, which is why the corners don't match. But I'm not going for cosmetics here, I'm going for functionality. Now you can also obviously see I've got zip ties on here. So the idea I'm going for here is that I've cinched these up near the top of the second section of fiberglass mast. So it's relatively sturdy up here. I didn't go to the very first section of the mast because it's kind of flimsy, and truth be told on mine it's a little bit broken and messed up. So I wanted to start with the second section. So I've cinched these up near the top. And the idea here is that this is going to slide down to a certain point and stop and not go any further. But I could still slide this right off of here when I want to pack it up and put it away. On the eyelet on the very top section of my mast, I used to have one of these key rings to keep it from falling down in the other sections. But this key ring isn't going to fit through these zip tie loops when I want to slide this over the top. So I've taken that off and I've used this small zip tie through the eyelet, and I'm just going to kind of leave it like this with a little bit of a loop in it. And that way I can still tie off to the top here if I want, and it'll keep it from falling into the other sections. Before I go any further, I'm going to take a little bit of super glue and I'm going to put a dab inside each zip tie so that it doesn't cinch up any tighter than it already is. And I'll do the same thing on my little one up at the top of my mast here. So I've gotten fairly far along with my first prototype, I'll call it that. And I'm not quite happy with it. I was trying to figure out how I wanted to attach the wires up here. I went a little crazy with drilling holes. Nothing was working out quite the way that I wanted it to. So I think I'm going to scrap this one and start over, even though I probably could salvage it. The biggest thing I want to change with this is to offset my zip tie loop. And the reason for that is because I want to secure the ladder line to the T, but I want this to all be centered so that everything is nice and uniform when it kind of goes up and connects out to the radiating wires. Right now, if I keep it in the center and put zip ties or something like that, it's going to interfere with these zip ties, which are holding it to the mast. So I'm going to offset those. It's not going to matter if this sits on the mast one side or the other. It'll be just fine that way. And then I can have my ladder line in the middle. So I'm going to start off with that in mind. I'm going to make the T a little bit smaller as well. It doesn't need to be this tall. So it's going to be a little bit shorter, slightly narrower. And I think this time I am going to try and at least rough measure where I'm going to put the holes so that things come out a little more uniform. But I did learn a lot from just messing around with this and trying to get some ideas on how I wanted to configure this. I know what you're thinking. Why doesn't this guy just model this thing up in CAD and figure it all out that way? Well, There's a couple reasons for that. First of all, is that I spend 10, maybe sometimes more hours a day on the computer for work. And today's my day off. I don't want to look at a computer today. I just want to mess around in the garage and see what I can come up with what I've got laying around. But under normal circumstances, it would probably be a good idea to model this up in CAD first. Obviously, especially if you're going to 3D print it or laser cut it or something like that. But even if you weren't going to do that, it's probably a good idea to just draw it up in CAD and make a stencil first. But obviously, we're not doing that today. Obviously, cutting the plastic this way creates some kind of melty blobs on the side, so I'll just kind of deburr this thing with my razor knife. So I've obviously got everything all deburred now, well, for the most part anyway, and I've measured out where I want the mast pole to go, and then I've made marks where I can drill my holes for my zip ties. I've already screwed up here. You can see I used a step bit to make these first two set of holes, and I made that one a little bit too big. I'm going to switch back to a regular bit and do the rest of these. I don't think I had the camera rolling, so I'll give you a little update. I drilled a couple of holes up here to accept these 1/4 bolts that came from Harbor Freight, I think. Either way, you can see I've got the ladder line stripped back, and I've got the wire just wrapped around the bolt right now. I was going to use a ring terminal, something like this, to crimp on there, but I may just use this wraparound and bolt it down. I'm not sure. But right now it's just kind of loosely sitting here so that I can kind of approximate where it's going to run. And now I'm going to drill some holes for zip ties so that I can zip tie the ladder line to the feed point. I ended up bringing in a lock washer to put between the nut and the cutting board. But I think I am just going to wrap the wire around and let it connect that way. No sense introducing a connector if we don't need to. Okay, so now I'll just tighten these up. So at least the lock washer crushes down and we have a little bit more bolt length to work with so that we can bolt the other wire to it eventually. I'll just clip off the excess wire. Now I'll zip tie the ladder line to the cutting board. We're back to where we were with the first center support. I've got all the zip ties for the mast set here and tensioned, and then of course I've got the ladder line zip tied as well. So I'm just gonna clip off all the tails here, and then once I'm done with this, I'll put a little super glue on these zip ties that are on the mast again, so that the zip ties don't tighten up when this is not on the mast. I don't need to drop any super glue on the ones that hold on the ladder line, because even if those tighten up, that's not going to be a problem, and I don't expect that they're going to loosen up, so I think we're good there. For no other reason than I think it'll be a convenient link for portable work, I'm measuring out 30 feet of the ladder line. I've got the feed point with the end of the ladder line over there at the back of the garage, and I'm going to just measure it out with my tape measure here on the ground. That should be good, and I think I still have over 200 feet of this stuff to play with for future antenna experiments. For my radiating elements, I'm going to be using this 22 gauge wire that I picked up on Amazon. This stuff is nice and lightweight, and it's silicone, so it doesn't tangle up too easily. I've also drilled 3 holes on either side so that I can thread the wire through and kind of strain relieve it. And now I want to crimp on a ring terminal, but the only ones that I have that fit the wire are too small for this bolt that I've used. So I'm going to turn this into a spade lug by simply just clipping part of the ring off of it. Like I said, cheap and cheerful. Give that another twist, bring in the lug, get it positioned, and crimp it on. A lot of times I also like to remove the insulation and solder the lugs if I think I'm going to be using this in a more permanent installation. But like I said before, this is cheap, cheerful, and kind of proof of concept, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. We'll just bring in another nut and cinch it down. So for the doublet, we're going to need 2 1/4 wavelength radiating elements, just like we would for a dipole. So if I do the math out, it's going to be 468 divided by frequency, so somewhere around 7.2 megahertz, and that should get us somewhere around 31 or 32 feet, something like that. But for a doublet, we don't have to be quite as critical as we would be for a dipole, because we're going to be using a tuner with this antenna anyway. So as you can see, I've got my tape measure just kind of roughly out here. We'll get our rough 35 feet strung out. I'll cut this element, and then we'll repeat everything on the other side. And then I think we're going to be ready to test this. So I actually cut the second leg just a few inches longer than the first one, or at least I think I did. Now I know I said the length of the wires isn't critical, But what I do want to make sure that I'm careful about is making sure that they are as identical to the same length as possible. So I'm going to stretch these out, get them even, and trim them together. I've brought the far end of the wires back to the workbench so that I can add wire clamps onto them. This way I can form a little bit of a loop here, and then I can tie off a rope to this and then use it as a stake point. So just like the wire, I found these clamps on Amazon, and I'll leave a link below in case you're interested in checking them out. Now that everything is all assembled, let's set this up and try it out. Now obviously I've got my mast set up. Hopefully you can see it in the camera, but I've got my 3 guy ropes attached to my hose clamp that's on the mast here, and then they just go off the stakes in the grass, and that should hold everything nice and steady. Now I can just grab the feed point. I've got my zip tie loops here, and I'm just going to slip them over the first section of mast. Now I gotta extend this and get the second section up into the zip ties as far as it'll go. That's about it. So now we should be able to just raise this thing up. So now I've got my radiating elements, and I've got a piece of rope on the end of it tied around that loop that we made. And I'm just gonna kind of put some tension on here, not too much, but some, and stake it out. I didn't plan it out like this, but the other leg happens to line up perfectly to the dog fence. So we're just gonna tie off to this. Just to keep the ladder line off the ground, I've brought in a bungee cord and wrapped it around the mast just above the guy point. Now I can kind of turn this roughly 90 degrees and send it over to the operating position. Earlier in the video, when I cut the original length of the ladder line, I said I cut it to 30 feet because I thought that would be a convenient length. You probably already saw this coming, and maybe the text I put in the video also alerted you to it, but 30 feet doesn't make sense given the fact I'm using a 31-foot mast and the antenna is, you know, kind of slightly down from the top. So I needed to splice in some more ladder line. I chose about 15 more feet so that I could get my operating position kind of away from the antenna. But after kind of looking at this a little bit, I did some research on ladder line length, and I also found that 30 feet might be close to a suboptimal length for the feed line. We want to stay away from quarter wavelength increments on any band that we want to operate on. And 30 feet, and this is probably a little bit longer than 30 feet, it's probably closer to 31, is very close to a quarter wave on 40 meters. So that might have caused us some problems with tuning. So like I said, I added about 15 more feet or so to the ladder line, and let's get everything hooked up and see if this thing tunes up. Now that we've got everything set up, let's take a look at the whole picture. Obviously the mast is there. You can see the orange guy ropes. There's 3 of them. If we pan up the mast, you can see the feed point is up there, somewhere around 29 or 30 feet. And you can see one leg of the antenna is going off over here to the grass and is staked down with just a regular stake. And then if we look at the other leg of the antenna, you can see it's staked off over here to the dog fence right there. The ladder line hangs straight down, even though there's a little bit of a curve in the mast due to the tension from the wires. And then it takes a 90-degree turn and goes over here off the ground by about 2 feet or so to the operating position. The radio I'm using is my trusty Yaesu FT891, powered by a 15 amp hour LifePo 4 battery that's down on the ground. And then, as I mentioned earlier in the video, we're going to need a tuner for this antenna. So I've brought out my MFJ 949E tuner. Looking at the back of the tuner, you can see that this one has a balanced line input. So I've connected the ladder line directly to those terminals. I'm a little embarrassed to admit this, but in my defense, I've never used a ladder line antenna before, so I really didn't know. But when you connect up to the ladder line inputs on your tuner, you need to connect up one leg of the ladder line to one of the balanced inputs, and the other leg needs to go to the other. That kind of makes sense. But you also need a jumper between one of the balanced lines and the wire input. There's actually a dotted line silk screened on the back of this thing to kind of let you know that. It also says that in the manual, but who reads manuals, right? I hooked this up and I only connected up to the 2 balanced line input, and I was disappointed. I couldn't hear anything, the antenna wouldn't tune, I didn't know what was going on. So I took a few minutes, did a little research, found my mistake, and now I've got this leg of the ladder line connected up between these 2 terminals, and everything seems to be working just fine. To get the antenna matched up properly, We need to put the radio into a mode where it will generate a carrier, so AM or CW, something like that. Now in my case, I've put the radio in AM, and for various reasons, it's also good to tune with low power. So I've set the AM power down to 5 watts. Now before I actually transmit with the radio, I'm going to turn the volume up and listen to the receive, and then I'm going to change the inductor selector until I hear the most amount of noise and static coming from the speaker. So I think in this case, setting F is where we want to be. Now it's going to be less noticeable, but I'll try to do the same thing with the transmitter control and the antenna control. That should get us in the ballpark. I'm ready to key up and see what we've got. Now I've got the radio in SWR mode, so when I key up, we should get a direct SWR reading. And of course, we'll also see it on the needles over there on the tuner. Oh, and I almost forgot, I've got the meter set to the 30 watt scale right now, since we're only running 5 watts on the radio. So I'm gonna key up, and you can see we're getting some power out and we're getting some SWR. So now I'm gonna try and tune the transmitter control. You can see it went up, and now when I tune it that way, it's going down. So I'm gonna get that dip. Now I'm gonna unkey and let things rest for a second or two, and then I'm gonna key back up and I'm gonna tune the antenna control and see if I can get a dip there. And then I'm just gonna kind of repeat the process until I get that as dipped as I possibly can. I think we're ready to get on the air and see if we can make a few contacts. November 1, November Uniform Golf.
November 1, November Uniform Golf. I got you 5-7, New Hampshire. This is Alpha Charlie 1, Romeo Hotel,
Okay, despite the fact I was off frequency and was touching up the tuning while I was transmitting, I think everything's working good. Let's see if we can make a few more contacts.
This is Nancy Ocean to Nancy.
November 1, November Uniform Golf.
November 1, November Uniform Golf, 59 plus, great audio here into Charleston State Forest. November 1, November Uniform Golf, 68 or 69, somewhere in there, from US 5469. November 1, November Uniform Golf. You are 59 here in the Commonwealth, it's Mount Haven, Mark 0625.
So 40 meters seems to be working pretty well. Now, obviously, as I tune around the band, the antenna isn't perfectly matched. And as I've been transmitting, I've sometimes touched up the antenna control to try and get it matched a little better, but I don't think I really even need to do that. I think it's working just fine, even with a slight mismatch. But now let's go over and try 20 meters. See if we can get it tuned up over there and make any contacts on that band. So it looks like we've got a pretty good tune on 20 meters. Let's tune around and see if we can make some contacts. November 1, November Uniform Golf.
November 1, NUG, thank you very much. Robert 59 plus. Hi, thanks for Connecticut and regards from Slovenia. Robert, good DX to you, thank you. Bob, 051, Denmark X-ray. Georgia, Kilo India 5, Golf, November Hotel.
November 1, November Uniform Golf.
November 1, November Uniform Golf, you're 5 and 9 in New Park. November 1, November Uniform Golf, Robert 5969, Robert.
November 1, November Uniform Golf. Nancy 1, Nancy, United Germany.
Okay, GFL, good afternoon. The signal report here is at the 55 in Argentina. Thank you very much for the call. Have anything?
So I really only heard that one station from Argentina on 15 meters, but obviously the antenna tuned up and worked fine on that band. Let's try 10 now. I'm not really having any luck getting 10 meters tuned up. I might need to play around with the feed line length a little bit, or maybe even the wire length, but I've cycled through all the settings here, and I'm just not able to get this thing really under a 3-to-1 SWR. Well, we weren't able to get 10 meters, but believe it or not, I've got a pretty good tune on 6 meters here, at least in the sideband portion of the band. November 1, November Uniform Golf, calling CQ 6 meters and standing by.
N1NUG from Kilo 1, India, Florida, Florida. My name is Cliff, Charlie, Lima, India, Fox, Fox. And I'm over here in Bristol, over.
Now this really shouldn't work on 80 meters, but I just tried it anyway, and I can almost get a tune. I can get it down to about 2-to-1 SWR there if I'm real careful, but it is touchy. I'd say this antenna is working pretty well. Now obviously it didn't tune up too good on 10 meters, and we can't really use it on 80. I wouldn't expect to be able to anyway. But we did get 6 meters as a bonus, so that's pretty cool. So I think the next thing I want to do is try this out on a POTA activation, get it out in the field and see what kind of results we get. But for now, let me know down in the comments what you think. Is this an antenna that you've tried out before? And if you have you had success with it, or has it not worked out for you? And if it's something that you want to try in the future, let me know how you'd build it. I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on better construction methods. I obviously just kind of slapped this thing together real quick in the garage. If I'm going to rebuild it again in the future, I would probably do things a little bit differently. So I'd love to hear what your ideas are as well. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. 7-3, and thanks for watching.